Hello again. So by now you should have read the Ragin articles on the comparative method and the excerpts regarding Mill's methods of agreement and direct method of difference. So I'll just quickly go through some of the important highlights and some of the major ideas that you should have taken from this. So let's move on here. Okay, so oops, go back here. So the idea, I mean, essentially, as Ragin says, and he quotes Swanson in his first chapter rather. He is thinking without comparison is unthinkable, and comparison, I mean, is really the essence of all scientific thought and scientific research, or in our case, social scientific thought and social scientific research. And even when you were not explicitly comparing, we at least have to analyze at least and compare implicitly. So more on what that means later and throughout the course. Okay, so the comparative method is just a particular, according to Ragin, is the particular definition of comparative method as it's used in comparative politics is usually in a narrow sense. It refers to a specific kind of comparison, and that's the comparison of large macro social units. So the macro social units that will most be studying most this semester will be countries. So different states, different countries around the world, and comparing them against each other on the basis of various factors, dimensions, and phenomena. Okay, so there are twin goals of comparative social science: to explain. Remember, explain is about answering the question words how and why, in addition to the descriptive question words who, where, what, and when. And then also to interpret macro social causation. Okay, so let's move beyond that. That's not that important. Okay, so the comparative method. So comparatives are interested in questions that are limited, often substantively and historically. Okay, and the use of macro social units, as I said, in our case, countries mostly, often presents what are called serious degrees of freedom problems. And degrees of freedom freedom is essentially a way of saying how many variables do we have as opposed to the number of cases. And when we have exactly the same number of variables as the number of cases, then we get into what's called a 0 degrees of freedom problem, which makes our analyses what is called indeterminate. We'll get to more to this in a second. So, and as the number of relevant observation decreases, for example, let's look at revolutions. There are only a handful of revolutions that have ever occurred, and if we try to compare revolutions against each other, the possibility of subjecting this very small set of all possible revolutions to rigorous statistical analysis diminishes. So, and statistical analysis is a good way of trying to explain social phenomena and social causation, or at least intuit social causation, when there are many cases or many observations. Now, when we don't have very many observations, and one of the things we can use is the comparative method. And this is a way of using logic to sort of as a substitute for statistical analysis. Okay, so what is the logic of the comparative method? Well, as I said here, the comparative method is based on logical methods to simulate experimental conditions. And essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand what the causal conditions of phenomena are. Okay. Now, this is where Mill comes in, in social sciences. I mean, actually, the first real comparativist, if you want to go back, I mean, at least in sort of, our sort of Western-centric history, was Aristotle, who went around, and in fact, if you read his book, the Politics, Aristotle, in fact, systematically compared constitutions in various Greek city-states. So in sort of the more modern times, John Stuart Mill was a strong proponent of the comparative method, and he used what are called method of agreement and method of difference. There are two methods of difference. We'll look at only the direct method